that note, I now officially give you the call to the member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, but I'm sorry to burst people's bubble. I am actually not quite fully awake after that speech. In fact, quite a reverse contribution from a member for Whitlam. Instead, it became a diatribe of repeated lines and rehearsed lines that I've no doubt he does in front of the mirror each morning. The other day, in an alternative debate, he referred to the expression in the context of my good self that one drinks their own bathwater. As anyone who's had to go and look up something on Urban Dictionary has seen, as I have from time to time, when you hear that young new hip speak, and it's ridiculous to think that might apply to the member for Whitlam, but let's accept it as it is. On face value, the reference means that one basically believes their own spin, but I could use a more crude, unparliamentary term to refer to how the member for Whitlam, I'm sure, intended it. And that speech...
Let's not.
Let's not? No,
yes.
No, I'm upholding standards, Deputy Speaker. But the member for Whitlam just gave a speech which amounted to definitely not just drinking in one's own bath water, but drowning in it. It offers a continued insight into what the objectives of this opposition are, which is, of course, when the government does something constructive, as this, frankly, relatively straightforward administrative legislation does, there is no recognition that we're focusing on the job that's ahead of the Australian people and we have to support the government to do its role. Instead, it's a focus, as the member for Fenner will be well aware, which is to tacitly support while using it with a backhanded compliment, because the only intention really is to play petty politics in any conversation. And there's no topic, Deputy Speaker, that gets them more energised in this chamber. Once upon a time, Deputy Speaker, it was if they felt that workers were under attack because they were the party that represented organised labour. But today there is no topic that gets Labor members more exercised than anything else. Nothing that gets them faster onto their feet. Nothing that gets them as energised and impassioned with their speeches than if anyone dare criticise or raise concern with parts of organised capital under the superannuation system. Because the Labor Party always has this vision, Deputy Speaker. We on this side of the chamber see the success of the nation through the success of the Australian people. The success of our party is when the Australian people do well. The modern Australian Labor Party has never seen the success of the nation through the success of mums and dads, everything in between, families, communities. They see it through the success of themselves, and that when in doubt they have to write a constant narrative to delude themselves into the pursuit of continuing on their cause because they think that they are the only ones who have the answers for the future of this country. And so, particularly the discussion around superannuation, which of course comes up in the context of this bill, around making sure that the system works and works equitably and fairly, particularly in the context of relationships that have ended, is their only contribution is how does it fit within the narrative of the Australian Labor Party and its vision for the country. It can't actually be how is this good for mums and dads or couples who are going through divorces. It's what's the impact on the Labor Party? How is this advancing our narrative and our cause? And that's why in the end they always struggle, Deputy Speaker, when talking about legislation this or proposals they put up before elections, to ever get resonance with the Australian people, because it's actually about themselves. There's a reason you've successfully stayed on that side of the chamber for most of the history of the Commonwealth of Australia, and don't get me wrong, may it continue. But it's because you think governing for Australia is actually about governing for the Labor Party and its pursuit and its objectives. And superannuation is, of course, a classic example of that. As I said, it gets the party for organised capital is how I would refer to the modern Labor Party, and all of the pursuits and various avenues in which its tentacles get into the operations and the judgment calls. of the Labor Party today, and infects every decision that they make. And I know, Deputy Speaker, there'll be members on the other side who will take exception to that, but they won't deny it. They won't argue it's wrong. They'll just take exception to somebody pointing it out. But let's get explicitly to the legislation we're discussing. The member for Whitlam did go through the various practical effects of the legislation and what it's seeking to entail, and said there's issues around the amendment of the Competition and Consumer Act regarding the franchising code. Most people seem to think that these are good ideas. And, of course, some of the issues around deregulation, actuarial certificates for self-managed super funds. And I love that we get to return to this topic once more. One of the reasons why the Labor Party is reluctantly supporting this bill is because it applies to self-managed super funds. But they want it to apply to larger funds, the ones with larger overheads where you actually hand over money to other people to take responsibility for it, where you lose control of it, and where they and their mates, and particularly their fund manager mates, get to harvest it for fees and insurance premiums to boost their own profits. There's a reason why we give self-managed super funds lesser regulatory burden in some contexts. It's because it's people controlling their own money. And you have higher regulations where they're not in control of their own money. Now, this should not become a particularly innovative process. I mean, when you hold your money, member for Fenner or Deputy Speaker, in your own pocket, we don't normally demand oversight of how it's being spent if you've earned it as part of the normal process of salary and income outside of your taxation obligations. But if you start handing it over to other entities to control, then we want to make sure they're doing the right thing with it, and that they're doing it on a basis of honesty and without deception, and to make sure that decisions are made in your best interests. So while I agree with the member for Whitlam, I would love to see a bonfire of red tape right at the heart of this chamber. The reality is, just because some super funds are in charge of other people's money and they willfully and wishfully spend it as they see fit, doesn't mean they're always doing the right thing. We found this in the Economics Committee, of which I'm very privileged to chair on behalf of this House, during our current inquiry, which the member for Fenner can attest to, despite attempts to run interference by some Labor members into the inquiry and certain aspects of it, where, for instance, we had low balance inactive accounts that were deliberately and maliciously being reactivated by industry super funds so they could harvest the retirement savings of low-income Australians for fees and insurance premiums to boost their own profits and bonuses for fund managers. Now, there was some very questionable conduct that emerged out of the Hayne Royal Commission, particularly with banks, with insurance industry, with retail super funds, and all of that behaviour was rightly called out. But some of the most almost poetic in its corruption was where we had fees being charged for no service. But sadly, we have found in the Economics Committee that just because Commissioner Hayne found some misconduct, there were stones unturned. And we have made a very deliberate effort to make sure we find where they are and to expose them to the cleansing light of day. And when we found fees for no service, and not just because of an administrative error, not just because money happened to be sitting there and there was an automation, but the deliberate and malicious and conscious harvesting of low-income Australians' superannuation savings to boost the profits and bonuses of fund managers and entities that, funnily enough, seem to give an awful lot of money to organisations like the ACTU, raises some pretty suspect questions about their intent and their nefarious agenda too. So yes, we put higher obligations when other people are watching their money, because the retail funds have been caught with their hands in the cookie jar and the industry funds have been done so as well. To be fair, at least the retail funds have admitted their behaviour. The industry funds continue to perpetuate a lie that they have nothing to answer for and they do no wrong, because during a royal commission, the stones that covered their misdeeds were unturned. And make no mistake, we will continue in the Economics Committee right to the end of this term to find every single stone we can in the retail space, in the industry space and in any other financial institution and hold them to account for their conduct. But I will say it's in the context, Deputy Speaker, where we had the large banks before the committee recently, and the member for Fenner was complaining about how they were making the argument that perhaps constantly turning up before the committee was unjustified or unnecessary. It's their choice. He's more than entitled to make that argument. And then he listed off a whole series of allegations of misconduct against them. And then the chair of the ABA, I can't believe I'm quoting Anna Bligh, but you know, this is where we all are. This is the parallel universe we operate in. Had to make the point that not a single one of the allegations of misconduct were highlighted by members of the committee, and particularly by members of the Labor Party. It was what we call, in modern parlance, if we go back to our urban dictionary equivalent of drinking your own bathwater, an epic slapdown. So we should focus on where there is misconduct and where there are misdeeds, and that's what this legislation seeks to do. But another part of the legislation, it is important, is around visibility when there is a divorce or separation and where superannuation comes into the context. Because the member for Whitlam is right, there is a disparity around the amount of superannuation that women have at retirement compared to men. And we all know that that's because of a number of factors, some of which we find very challenging, and we're constantly working on how it is we can correct some of those fundamental injustices that occur. But critically, when it is that people go and get divorced, and we hope that doesn't occur because, of course, marriage is one of the foundational bedrock institutions of our society and a fundamental good, when it occurs, it should be done in a way where assets are divided, that there's appropriate context so people can't hide their superannuation, which undermines the capacity for an equitable division. Least because, for another reason, because when people get divorced, often it can end up in a situation where assets are traded between the couple about who gets what, and often, and more often than not, women are left with less of their share. And that is wrong. But more critically, it's wrong because we then structurally favour those who get a house or are able to afford a house, and deliberately make it harder for women in, say, their 40s or 50s, who the biggest conscious decision they could then go on and make for their financial security in their working life and retirement is to be able to access their superannuation to be able to buy their own home with enough time to pay it off, under the collective lie that they are somehow better off having money denied to them at that critical stage of their life, and denied them that access to that funding so they can provide for the foundation of their security in their working life and retirement. We put super above homes. And I know this is a constant theme in the speeches that I give in this place, Deputy Speaker, and I will never back off. Because the biggest financial decision, the biggest decision Australians can make for their economic well-being, the biggest decision they can make for their personal security, for their choices in their life, is to own their own home. And the members of the Labor Party who come into this chamber and cry crocodile tears talking about these issues without a proper acknowledgement that they actively seek to deny post-divorce women the opportunity to be able to own their own home, to feather the nests of fund managers, or to hold themselves in shame. Because they actively engage in a form of economic social engineering designed to feather the nests of those that have many at the expense of those that have little. It is disgraceful. It sacrifices women's opportunity for economic security and opportunity in their working life and their retirement, just like they do so for young Australians who they force to deliberately kneecap them in their economic opportunity at earlier stages of life. It should be home first, super second. That's a pathway for economic security for all Australians.
Thank you.